That. Okay, and switching. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk about the thing we tried to talk about last week before Buddy had to go, which is too much. Which is how much is too much, part two. So this is part two of part two. So it's like the old Half-Life 2 joke, like Half-Life 2, like there was no Half-Life 3, but then there was Half-Life 2 stories, and that got two parts and didn't get a third part. So we're just gonna keep. Anyway,
The
before
general thesis
yeah,
of this episode was a follow-up to the previous idea, right? Which was us talking about in some of these live service games, right? How much is too much to kind of put in front of your player to do? So to use an example like World of Warcraft, you have world content, you have world quests and dailies and rares to kill, you have mythic plus dungeons to do that go into that feed into the vault and give you very high level gear, you have raids to do that feed into the vault and give you high level gear, you have arenas and raided battlegrounds that you can do that feed into the vault and give you high level gear, you have collecting that you can do, you have achievement hunting that you can do, you have all of these different activities, right? And when presented with this kind of smorgasbord of stuff to do, the question becomes how much is too much? Like, when are you putting too much in front of a player that you are not encouraging them to have a good full gaming experience, but instead you are encouraging them to essentially burn themselves out by doing absolutely everything all of the time? Um, which is an interesting question. We talked for an hour about it, right? The normal stuff. The interesting question, though, is what happens when you take that model and you kind of apply it to a single player game, right? Because single player games also tend to have a million different things to be doing at any individual time, right? And those things have only increased over time as we've gotten bigger and more powerful games that are bragging about being bigger and more powerful compared to some of their counterparts from however many years ago, right? Skyrim is bigger than Oblivion, is bigger than Morrowind, is bigger than whatever, right? And through the vein not of a live service game where you are kind of keeping up with, the seasonal model to this game, but from the perspective of this is a premium purchase, I'm going to buy it for $60. How much is too much to that to present to a player?
and,
So
there
yeah.
was there is a second part to that I do want to highlight up top is that part of this too is also talking about the breadth, right? Like the part of the thing that inspired me to pitch to push it the second week, and I'm not going to do the bit again, but I've been watching the Tim Rogers Cyberpunk 2077 review. And part of the thing he points out about Cyberpunk 2077 is even beyond like the amount of stuff in the game, the breadth of the way you play, um, and this is true of a lot of open world games, kind of gives you so much options, but you kind of end up filtering yourself typically towards an optimal strategy, because you have to do like because you have to make the game playable to everybody in every play style, right? Um, there's usually some optimal strategy that kind of trivializes the game. In Tim Rogers' case for Cyberpunk, it was quick hacks. In and the Skyrim meme is stealth archery, that kind of thing. So I think there's two facets there, right? Like how much in terms of systems and how much in terms of actual content. Just as a quick note, you were talking about Skyrim Morrowind. Daggerfall is actually the biggest video game world of all time.
That
Uh,
is true. That's actually why I avoided saying
okay.
it's bigger than Daggerfall.
Yeah, but it was all auto generated and it was terrible, which I think is an interesting part of this discussion, right? Like,
Yeah.
because that was definitely too much, which is why they made it smaller. Yeah, but
Yeah, so the piece about quick hacks is and stealth archery is really interesting because, like, I feel an impulse to sort of defend stealth archery from a design perspective, right? And here's the bedrock of my claim, I guess, when it comes to stealth archery. I think it is not a I don't think it is a representation of water finds a crack, right? I think it is a representation of activating a different kind of game mode inside of a game that has multiple sort of game modes that you can approach from it, right? So the classic example might be something like Deus Ex, where you can have sort of a guns blazing build, or you can have sort of a stealth build. And the thing about the difference that I really want to strike here is that um, something like quick hacks. To be fair, I have not watched the full video, so I haven't seen this part about quick hacks. The thing about quick hacks is it is a combat focused strategy that trivializes combat, right? You just walk up, you use your quick hacks. My understanding is that the quick hacks like spread to other people, so they're all clubbed together. You hit one of them, it spreads to the others, and they all drop dead. Is that right?
I mean, that's one of the ways you can do it. Yes, there's it's very customizable. There's a lot of powers, but yes, that is one of the things that can happen.
Okay. So the thing that is doing, which I think is different than stealth archery, is essentially saying, okay, I am going to find the most efficient way to defeat this combat encounter, right? By essentially whatever casting a spell that immediately kills my opponents before they ever have a chance to respond, essentially one-shotting them, you know, entirely. The thing about stealth archery that I think is different is that it is not about defeating the combat encounter. It is about replacing the combat encounter, right? The challenge of stealth archery is keeping yourself in stealth, right? It is dealing with stealth mechanics. It's keeping, out of eye lines and, in low light areas. It's hitting someone and then retreating and waiting for them to reset so that you can go back and hit them again, right? Like all of those things are real challenges and they're real tactics and strategies that you have to employ. And there is a failure case where you do get uncovered from stealth and have to fight the encounter. And obviously over time it gets easier and easier to do this in a game like Skyrim because your sneak goes through the roof and you buy shoes that excuse me, muffle your footsteps, and you learn spells that can reset combat, right? Charm spells or whatever that can force someone out of combat so that you can get back into stealth, right? But all of those things are advancing this sort of parallel stealth gameplay, which is in a sense being layered on top of and replacing the gameplay of a combat encounter, right? Whereas the thing that Tim Rogers is explaining it's not really replacing anything, right? It is just doing the thing to defeat the combat encounter in one one maneuver, right? Which is why I want to which is why I want to split that hair
So
because I do think it's important.
I will agree. So think about this. I agree that there is it is a separate failure mode now that you put it up. But still think it's a failure mode. So the failure mode, I think, for Cyberpunk and the quick hacks is, I think, to your point that you know, is that the quick hack minigame is not compelling, right? Like the quick hacks aren't really a mini game, and then like the parts like the hacking around it that works with it, right? Like hacking into security cameras and whatever. Like that mini game of like clicking like rows and of pairs of digits, that's not super compelling. And I think that's the failure mode for the quick hack side of it, is that the gameplay that surrounds that loop isn't compelling. Which is something that you've pointed out. Like stealth archery has compelling elements. I think the failure mode for stealth archery is that everybody is driven to it because kind of version 1 of stealth archery is applicable. Is there's no reason not to take it, right? Like you are almost always going to have the drop on an opponent in a combat, so you might as well pull out a bow and take a stealth shot. And so it kind of funnels everybody to at least doing a little bit of stealth archery. And because it's so universal, I think it funnels everybody down that path, which I think is it's failure mode, as it were.
Yeah, I also do think that players are risk averse, right?
Yeah.
Which is part of this. Even in a game like Far Cry, right, which also sort of has a stealth archery path and a guns blazing sort of path, right? Um, the thing that happens in a game like Far Cry that's kind of interesting is that you get big bonuses for doing things in all stealth, but it is harder to sort of pull that off, right?
Yeah.
Which is to say that it's harder to get guards to reset or whatever. Once they know, like they are on some level of alert, and that is tough, right? And on top of that, there's all these extra pieces. There's alarms throughout a camp, right? That might need to go off, right? Or that might like go off. There might be, like reinforcements that arrive, that kind of thing. And I think in that sort of situation, it increases the amount of risk to going the stealth archery sort of path. And even though I do think a lot of people probably do play Far Cry from that sort of stealth archery perspective, it is more truly a replacement for a combat simulator than something like Skyrim, right? Where it really doesn't feel like there's a downside to, at the very least, starting combat by plinking away with enough arrows until the guy sees you, and then you get out, pull out your sword and start wailing on him, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's exactly correct. The Far Cry thing I think also has it like if you decide to ignore the bonus, right? Like I think it's again a third failure mode, which is you incentivize a particular mode of play over your other modes of play, right? With bonuses. But even if we ignore that, right? There's still no disadvantage to pulling out your sniper rifle and taking a shot, even if it's not silenced, right? Like your first shot is probably going to be out of a sniper rifle at somebody to like one shot somebody, right?
Yeah. And that game also trivializes it, or it's complicated because some of them have silenced weapons and some of them don't. But the most efficient way to deal with any encounter in Far Cry is to get up on a hill with a silenced sniper rifle and just mow a bunch of people down. Right before that, you just take a million headshots. And maybe to a certain extent that's fun. Maybe to a certain extent, I've definitely fucked up a headshot, and when a bullet goes whizzing by someone's head in that game, they are alerted to it, and you have less ability to react to that sort of thing, right? In Far Cry, the alarms are something that you like want to deal with as a stealth operative, because if they see triggered, or if you shoot an alarm from really far away and they see it, that will trigger them, right? But yeah, like I feel like there is no version of a game where you cannot progress to such a point that you have trivialized its combat by leveling up and creating a build sort of built around trivializing the combat.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing because I think the game like so two different things here. First, you said that like the sniping can be fun. I agree. But the problem I think is like a game like Sniper Elite, right, is built around the sniping and does the sniping like as a pretty exclusive thing, right? What you have with something like Far Cry is a game that supports all of these modes of play and puts a bunch of dev effort into all these modes of play for people to only play sniper mode, which is like not as good as like Sniper Elite, right? Like a Sniper Elite put all of its effort into like literally like testicle shredding animations for the sniper, yep. Right?
Not to mention that Sniper Elite is much harder than Far Cry sniping.
Right.
Like obviously, most games take a lot of liberties with this, but one of the things that is a neat draw about Sniper Elite is that one, you don't have a lot of bullets, and two, it is an incredibly dangerous sort of thing to be to kind of like be engaging in, right? Though I will say, like, obviously all of these are single player games and people, right? Like I don't really end up doing a lot of sniping when I'm playing Far Cry. My preferred mode of play is to be relatively close quarters. Stealth person, mostly using the bow and arrow. You can't use the bow and arrow from super far away, but you can use it pretty close range. It's also a silent weapon. And the big thing about the bow and arrow is it basically one hit kills anything on a body shot, which is pretty huge. But like, yeah, I definitely think that the funnel exists for sort of all of these games, and to a certain extent, that's just that is the water finds a crack piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah. And the thing I wanted to bring up is that I think Deus Ex, what's it, specify the deluxe edition or the director's cut, does a good job of making it a different experience for each of the modes of play, right? It's a much smaller game. It's not exactly an open world game, right? But like the stealth game is a very different game. Like playing a stealth run is a very different run than playing the guns blazing run. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I think they do it well. And I think that's actually kind of at the core of a lot of my criticism of um, of a lot of these games is that because all basically the developers have decided that all encounters must be defeated by every playstyle, whereas I think the correct way to do it is to just lock people out of certain opportunities if they're certain specs, right? Like that's kind of like the reward of the gameplay. There's like I think development issues there, but I think from like a pure kind of like not taking into account dev reality's point of view, that the right way to do it is to have certain things that can only be accomplished by certain characters. And so each character has a different run through the game because there's they can't, your close quarters person can't defeat every encounter that the long range person can, and vice versa. And so
Yeah.
there's reason to pick other alternate options.
Or something that I think about a lot is like the contours of the experience are different, right? So even if I'm walking into the exact same outpost with the exact same enemies, right? Maybe if I'm a close quarters person, the flamethrower guy who has a lot of body armor and won't die with a single arrow shot is very dangerous for me, right? And I have to plan around him in a much different way, right? Versus if I'm playing the sniper, well, that guy is actually pretty easy to just headshot from across the distance. But the tough thing for that play is maybe there's maybe there's a guy who pats around, but he stays mostly indoors, and it's very hard to get a sight line on him, right? And I have to find a good way, right? The contours of those two experiences are very different depending on the approach, because the individual enemies inside of it are meaningfully different.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that's a little bit harder to pull off because I think you end up, kind of like down the funnel. It's like, well, the guy that pats around inside is actually trivialized by the sniper because he's the last enemy, and you just walk up and shoot him with a shotgun, right? Whereas like you have to fight the flaming body armor guy, right? Like in combat at some point, and you can't necessarily isolate him, right? Like this is like kind of an example. I think that's a harder
Yeah.
one to pull off. Is the thing I'm trying to pinpoint here.
Okay, so a lot of this is obviously interesting, but it is a little bit secondary to what we are coming here to talk about, right? Um, so where do you think the I guess the too much single player stuff kind of hits in the discussion?
In what way? I'm sorry, I don't quite follow your.
I just mean to say, so we've been talking a lot about the different approaches that you can have to a game like this, right?
Right.
But when it comes to how much is too much stuff, how does that interact with all of these different approaches, right? Is trying to make a game that supports multiple different approaches the source of this too much problem that are in some of these single player games where I burn out on Mass Effect Andromeda, even though I may like huge portions of it because it's asking me to go do some, stupid world puzzle that I don't want to do.
So I think that's part of it, right? Like that. That it's asking you that it's asking you to do too many things. I also think part of it is that for the type of person who likes to be a completionist, which I think is what you're gonna like, generously call your like core gamer type, right? Like, um, because the developers expect like the developers plan as if your gamer is going to either your average player is going to do like the main quest line and a handful of side objectives, right? Whereas I think the reality is more like you've got like it's instead of being like a curve, right? Like with like most people do like the main quest and a couple things. I think it's actually kind of bimodal, right? You've got like the person that does like the bare minimum, and then the person that does everything, right? And the person that does everything is going to be very overpowered very quickly, right? Like the way I finished Far Cry 5 is I did a ton of stuff in my first area, and I did basically none of the side content in the second two areas because I didn't have anything left to unlock, right? There was no reason to other than like a couple of like cosmetic things, right? Or a couple
Yeah.
of specialty things. Um uh and then on the other side, like that game is very like I think they designed the game or it seems to me that the games are designed to be completable but tough for that person that doesn't really do anything. Um and you like I don't think the harder difficulties scale hard enough for in most games for the person who wants to do everything, because a lot of it translates to just pretty raw power, right? A game that I think does this kind of well is Elden Ring, which has a ton of stuff to do, but a lot of the power gains are pretty lateral, right? Like your reward at the end of most things is an item of some sort. But like it's usually like one of a set, right? Like it's a charm for which you have like a handful of slots, or it's a spell that like maybe your character can't cast that type of spell or any spell, or it's a weapon of which you're using one or two, and the given weapon might not be the type of stat that you're specializing in, right? And I think that works out a lot better, and um, and it doesn't, for whatever reason, and maybe this is just me being an Elden Ring fanboy, but like finding an item that I can't use but that I know would be useful for some character doesn't feel as bad, um, as kind of like redundant power, right? Like there was like like some tens of upgrade points, if I recall correctly, in Far Cry 5. And I got almost all of them in the first area, like I said, right? And also like there's like, and I think part of it too is I didn't find them particularly like the challenges to get them particularly compelling. Whereas like, in Elden Ring, the dungeons are like they repeat some assets, but they're all a little bit different. And I find like the challenge itself to be rewarding, even if I'm not, doing anything, getting anything particular out of the rewards.
Yeah, I also think that Elden Ring, one of the things we talked about is Elden Ring doesn't have a map and it doesn't have like markers for this stuff. But like, I went back to Assassin's Creed Valhalla the other day and that map is full of markers, right? Including in the bottom corner for any region that you're in, it shows you the number of treasures and the number of like little anomalies uh, that you have investigated and you have left to investigate. And just those UI elements have a really powerful kind of psychological effect to get me to kind of chase these things down. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So actually, I have it's kind of a question in that vein, right? Like how how valid do you think it is for like somebody to say, if it's bothering you, turn off those UI elements and ignore them, and that's the right, because part of me wants to say like okay, but it's there, right? Like, and I kind and it feels weird kind of ignoring it, right? Like Elden Ring doesn't put it in the game, and I could go find it outside the game, but the fact that I have to step outside the game to go find it makes it not as compelling to me as it being like a toggle in the game.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish this stuff was toggled off by default, right? Like I do think that here's the best case scenario, right? I talk a lot about upsides and downsides. Anytime in any game any decision has ever been made, it is because someone weighed the upsides and downsides, right?
Right.
Which is a little bit different than what a lot of like I feel like if I'm watching a YouTuber, they are talking about good and bad design choices that are made throughout the course of like throughout the course of a game, which can sometimes paint this picture that like, well, what I cannot believe these fucking idiots made this choice, right? What absolute morons kind of thing. But the reality is that every like every decision has positives and negatives, right?
Sure.
And I think the big upside to including a UI element that shows you all of the stuff in the map, right, that you could be doing is that for a player who is really engaged with your title, that player wants to see that there is constant extra stuff to do, right? That you can really go hard and get every little nook and cranny, right? That there is always some new side quest or puzzle to solve or whatever else somewhere on the map to go sort of investigate. And I think the downside is that you burn players out, right? The players see all of this stuff, they are sort of they feel this compulsion to complete an area before moving past it, and that experience burns them out of the game because they are not doing something that like legitimately interests them in a sort of second to second gameplay. They're just ticking these check marks off of a to-do list, right? And that causes churn. And I feel like if you are in that, if that's the dichotomy that we're looking at, right? The proper way to handle this stuff is to have those UI elements turned off by default, right? If a person is someone who is so connected to the game that they are going to really like want to find that extra stuff, it is an easier ask to get them to turn it on than it is an ask to get this kind of compulsive completionist to turn it off, right? Because I think most people will orient their play around that default experience. And I don't think that someone who is mildly interested in the game is going to show up in the menus and turn on the thing because like they want to burn themselves. It's like I just don't think that that's the sort of reality of how it would happen. So that's sort of my philosophy.
So I think I'm going to disagree with you a little bit because I think there's a factor that you're not totally considering, which
Okay.
is one of the other downsides of having the markers on the map is somebody who values exploration doesn't really get that if like they're walking towards a marker, right? Like there is a part like of joy, and I particularly enjoy this in games, which maybe why I find this a little bit more acutely of me being like, there's probably a thing there, and then I go there, and then there's a thing there, right?
Mhm.
And that's like kind of like, oh, I was clever enough to spot that pattern, to spot that thing, right? And I found it out, and I did that because I was clever, and I didn't need anybody to handhold me there. And I think that that's lessened, maybe even kind of like cut off at the kneecaps if I can just go toggle that on, right? Because like then I'm not smarter than someone, right? I didn't do it because of my big brain. I did it because I like turned on baby mode and did it, right? Like I don't I don't get the the hypothetical sense of superiority in that case, which I think is like a thing to want, and I think part of the answer here is not every game has to be for every person, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so I'm not saying that like no markers is strictly better, but I definitely enjoyed the experience of exploring Skyrim and Elden Ring, which have like kind of discoverable markers method more than I did Far Cry 5, which honestly I was never exploring in Far Cry 5, right? I was beelining to a marker. And then the other game that reminds me of this is Shadow of War, or Shadow of Mordor, where I was beelining to the tower, and the tower put on, which is this classic Ubi Tower thing, right? You go to the tower, you activate the tower puts all the markers on the map, and then you just go beep bop bop boop boop bop to
Yeah,
get the things
there's
you
a part
want.
of me that actually does like that tower design because it sort of does make it uh a kind of like backhanded toggle in a way, right? Like
Yeah.
if you don't want the markers, you don't have to do that tower shit, right? Just the main quest will pop up. You can go do the main quest. You don't need to like climb these towers or whatever. And I also like the interaction of, oh, I'm in a new area. Would you look at that? There's a church. I bet that's like an eagle viewpoint kind of thing in one of these, like in an Assassin's Creed or something like that. But it definitely does have that experience of kind of highlighting putting the markers on the map, which is a little weird and not my favorite thing. I almost sort of wish maybe a better version of this would be like buying a treasure map, right? Um, you can imagine a version where you go to a store and you can spend a certain amount of money, right? And it will put the markers on the map for you to go do if that's the kind of thing that you're looking for. But obviously, you're maybe not. That's not what you're interested in.
Yeah, maybe. Something I enjoyed is like because this is something again Elden Ring does, or something, and something I think that could be done better too, because I don't think it's particularly well done in Elden Ring. Is like those towers, but they don't pop the icons. Like you literally just look around, right? I think feel like there's maybe it's Breath of the Wild does this where you just can't like it'll like I can't remember what there's at least there's a game where it'll like if you mouse over something and you highlight it, then it'll mark it. But I also think that that's not great because that's just kind of like the tower with extra steps. But I think the idea of like you get the vantage point and that lets you actually see things and like manually mark them. I think that's a better like for my exploration taste. That's a better version. That's a
Yeah, I
version that I would
also
like.
think I maybe like the Skyrim model Most. The Skyrim model has a lot of advantages. One, there's a bunch of stuff on the map that is already discoverable, right? You know where all of the major cities on the map are,
Right.
right? And you can also get certain breadcrumbs that will put the marker on the map for you if you accept a certain side quest. It'll say, go to this place. That will put both a quest marker to go there and the marker for the location on the map, which I think is a pretty fair sort of approach and a pretty fair sort of model when it comes to this stuff. But one of the things that's interesting about Skyrim is that it doesn't really differentiate between these different things, right? Like each of the icons are different, and so I might be able to tell, oh, well, this is a dwarven ruin, right? Because of the icon is like something dwarven related, or this is a barrow den because it has like the old barrows icon, or this place is maybe this place is completely unique because it has a completely unique icon. There are a couple dungeons like that, some around when it comes to Skyrim. Which is in comparison to something like Valhalla, right? In Valhalla, you have not just the icons, but you also have that little check mark at the bottom of the region, right? When you're in your map, you're looking at a region, it's showing you, right? Like here are the individual points throughout the map, right? And it's showing you how many of the maximum that you have done, right? Um, which is interesting. And I would say that, like, on one hand, I sort of wish that there was a difficulty mode that asked me for this level of completion, right? To sort of counteract the problem that you were talking about before. So, like, to put this in perspective, in Valhalla, my character is probably around like level 150. You get a lot of levels in Valhalla. Um, and I went up and I found a guy who was recommended level 220, right? But I was able to kill him pretty effortlessly, and I think a lot of that had to do with I have full cleared all of my zones so far, right? Such that I am sort of ahead of the zones that I kind of should be. And I do sort of wonder if there was a difficulty that was really tuned for a completionist, right? Something that's like, yes, you want to fully complete this zone before you move on. It will be dangerous for you to not do that thing. Would be an interesting way to approach difficulty rather than just like normal, medium, hard, right? Because if I'm doing only the main quests, having the correct difficulty for that is one thing. If I'm doing side quests and the main quest, maybe that's a different difficulty. If I'm doing everything, maybe that's a kind of a third difficulty.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think you know an insane difficulty for like or completion. Like, I don't think you want to call it insane. I think you want to call it completionist, right? Like, 'cause this is the case where kind of like we talk about like fake difficulty versus real difficulty, right? Like in some cases, but like I don't think this is the case where you necessarily want more advanced enemy patterns. What you want is the difficulty hard enough that like you really want to go do everything. Which honestly, I want to say that I think God of War got pretty close to that. Um,
Really
um,
interesting.
because I think the biggest problem with those with that kind of thing is curving it right. Because like I found God of War, the reboot, to be like frustratingly difficult at some points very early on, but then it hit like because I was playing it like on like either hard or very hard, and very early on I found it like frustratingly difficult such that I turned down the difficulty temporarily. Um, but then I turned it back up, and at that point, it felt about right. Once I had like my kind of like my feet on the ground, and I had gotten a couple of things done. It's just the opening chapter that felt really a little bit overtuned. And so I think that I can point to that as a good example, especially since I've been waiting for a sequel to that game for a long time. Since it's a very good game.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, I also think that's something that is hard to gauge when it comes to some of these open world games, right? Um, in Valhalla, one of the things that really helped me kill that guy who was 70 eye levels ahead of me was the fact that I had invested my points wisely, right? So the
Yeah.
way that game works is it's kind of this huge sprawling web, right? Um, and there are kind of minor nodes and major nodes in the web, right? And my approach to that was I looked at the major nodes that I thought were most important and most impactful, and that I wanted to get to the most. And I made smart sort of tactical decisions to get there in as few moves as possible. So at this point, I have a very filled out web when it comes to the major nodes, but I actually all of the connective tissue in those minor nodes is not, it's not there, because I've sort of optimized a lot of that sort of out, right? And in a world where I have access to all of these major effects that are giving me huge kinds of power upgrades, um, I think that kind of inflates the level of power that my guy is at, just kind of naturally speaking, right? So for instance, one of the nodes that I have says that when I dodge an attack, it sort of slows down time for like a second or two, right? Where I can move at the appropriate speed, but my opponent um, can't. And one of the things that I did in that encounter a lot was I triggered this thing over and over and over again, which meant that even though I was only plinking him for very small amounts of damage, I was getting in so many kind of free hits because for every one of his swings I could get in 10 of my own because I'm slowing down, like I'm slowing down time. And all of that stuff like decreases the chance that I'm going to get really sort of surprised uh by by extra kind of like damage like that.
So something that popped into my head is I think along with this, what you're talking about is something unless that we take it from JRPGs, especially like the classic ones, is uh super hard optional content, right? Like for like, and that's like the thing that you put out there for like your completionists, right? Like the main game is relatively easily done, or is not easily, but like it requires less investment. And then there's a piece of super hard optional content out there, in the game that you can go beat, for some reward of some description, and and that's the thing you give to your super hyper optimizers and super completionists. And I think that might be the right way to do it, right? Like you know, it's kind of like maybe like doing the achievements in WoW raids, right? Like extra stuff that you're not compelled to do in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of opportunity for sort of lateral power in that sense as well,
Yeah,
right? Like one of the things about some of these open world games is that maybe there is, so for instance in Far Cry, doing certain quests will get you access to special guns that have like, they're typically more powerful than normal guns, but they have a very set sort of kind of like loadout. Well, you can only equip 4 guns at a time, right?
right.
So and you have to kind of build up to 4. It starts at just, I think it starts at just one, or maybe like one in a pistol or something like that. Um, and in a world where you can keep rewarding people with interesting, powerful guns, but they can only ever equip a certain number of them, you kind of get to dodge some of this compulsion aspect, right? Because at the end of the day, I already have guns, and I probably have guns that I like. So why would I need to, feel this compulsion to go farther and do more?
Yeah, I think you need, again. I'm gonna go back to Elden Ring because I think it does it well. Is you need a mix of things that are like things you won't ever use, things that you could theoretically use and are easy to swap. Like this is the charms I'm talking about, right? Like one of the like there's a whole class of charms in Elden Ring that are like resistance to this type of damage, right? And like those are the one like I have like one of my slots is usually reserved for one of those that I swap in something if I'm fighting that particular thing, right? And those always feel good to get. Um, uh, and so you've, and then, on top of that, things you could potentially use, right? Like, things you can use, things that you can't use, but you could use at some point and they're aspirational, right? Like, I got a really big hammer that I can't use yet, right? Like, that's the thing. I keep putting points into my strength. I'll eventually get to use the big hammer, right? Like, um, and I think FromSoft's pretty good at this in general, right? Like, Elden Ring, I think is like, you know, obviously I've been gushing about Elden Ring for weeks, but like I think it's a masterclass in kind of like this level of design and kind of like getting it all kind of like right, um, and also like also getting it right in that it doesn't you don't feel compelled to do like because you don't have the markers on the map, and it's not like any of it's like raw power. Right, like if any of it was like, and some of it, you get souls, right? But souls are not a thing unique to the dungeons, right? Like they're also out in the open world. Not souls, they're runes, right? That's the Elden Ring currency. Um, um, and so like that's actually I think that's part of it too, right? Like I feel like a lot of like kind of like the base resource in a lot of these open world games is all gets kind of worthless really fast, right? But like Elden Ring, I think strikes a pretty good balance of as you progress through the game, runes are always valuable, right? Like even if I don't get something I want out of this dungeon, right, I will get a nice fat stack of runes that I will like use. But at the same time, it's not so necessary that I have to go kill them to get enough runes
Yeah.
for a level up. So I think
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think that there. See, this is sort of why I think that era in the late 20 or the early 2010s, late really just the early 2010s is such a fertile ground for some of these games to be at their best, right? I'm talking stuff like Mass Effect 2, Deus Ex Human Revolution, Dishonored is in here, obviously Skyrim,
Skyrim,
which we've talked about a bunch, right? And I think one of the things about that is that they were smaller games with more curated. Somewhere along the list, things were no longer like really kind of like hand picked and started being kind of, it feels like, procedurally generated, right? The difference between Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect Andromeda is that Andromeda has all these open world sections that have a bunch of things on a checklist for you to go do, and those things, I don't think they're procedurally generated, but they feel procedurally generated, right? Whereas any of the side content that was happening in Mass Effect, in Mass Effect 2, I mean, all of that stuff was really, really kind of tightly curated stuff, right? And that is the part where I want to say like less is more, right? Where
yeah.
that level of restraint actually makes for a better, more streamlined experience. Because, and this is for two reasons. One, you don't run into this situation with difficulty, right? Because you have a real cap on the amount of stuff that you can kind of accomplish, right? And even though there's leveling up in Mass Effect, you're getting more powerful and everything like that. The game is in these sorts of bands that, like, I don't really think anybody who is blitzing through the game is going to have an impossible time completing objectives, right? Nor is someone who is taking their time and doing absolutely everything. That person is also going to have, a relatively easy, a relatively similar experience,
But they're not going to
comparatively.
totally outclass the content. Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly, right? Which is something that I feel like has happened to me in a lot of these, Cyberpunk is a good example. And Cyberpunk is a good example even though I was mostly trying to do the story, right? But I realized, hey, I want some Mantis Blades. I saved up for Mantis Blades. I got Mantis Blades. Now Mantis Blades trivialize the entire rest of the game for me. I like it. That's it. The game is functionally over. And the only thing I did is I did one romantic subplot with the driver chick who is a nomad whose name I don't remember, and I
Pan
did the
Am.
main quest. Yeah, those are the two. That's it. I didn't do anything else, right? Um, and at that point, I do think it's sort of like a failure of sort of like difficulty and scaling and creating that meaningful that meaningful progression. And I do want to say that I am actually pretty sympathetic, all things considered, to the plight of developers who have these sorts of pressures heaped upon them. Right. One of the things that people don't like about certain games like Skyrim, or Fallout 4 or whatever else is when there are enemies that scale dynamically to their level, right? Because part of the feeling of an RPG, right, is you get to go to an area where you dramatically you walk into an area and it's very hard. You leave, you level up, you come back, it's easy now, right? That's a huge component to what people feel when it comes to an RPG. This is something we've talked about in WoW before, right? Where there used to be this really dynamic world scaling that basically said, okay, well, any mob that you fight is going to scale up to be about as powerful as any other mob that you fight. But one of the things that makes the progression of a WoW patch fun is that in the first patch I'm going and I'm fighting these mobs and they're really hard and they're really difficult. But then in the third patch I can come back to that same area and I can wipe the floor with them, right? Which is, that's complicated.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to nail, right? Because like, yeah, it's Yeah, I don't know if I've got anything else to add to that, but I think you're absolutely right. Right, like that, like everybody complains about the dynamic scaling, but that's like how you keep things at pace, I guess. Huh. I wonder if I can think of a good way to solve that. Right, like there was a thing. I remember like reading some of these, like maybe a thing like pins to the level that you first discover it at, but like then there's like weird side effects of like you run around the map, right? Like you pin everything at a low level. Um, uh, or like a way to deal with that problem in particular, right? Because like Elden Ring is obviously very kind of like it's very curated, right? Like I think that procedurally generated, I don't think was the right term there. I think it just feels generic. Some of the open world things. I feel like that's true in a lot of these games, right? Like a lot of stuff feels generic, and I think part of that is like I think part of that's just kind of like resource development, like like resource availability, right? Like FromSoft, like the FromSoft games are good looking, but like they are like that kind of like double A ish space where like they look good, but not so good that like you know devs can't spend time like curating content, right? I don't know. Maybe I'm um portraying the way it's built wrong, but like it feels like the people at FromSoft have the time and the ability to custom kind of like mold all of the encounters, right, to feel relatively unique. Even if you're building on type of generic building blocks, right? Like a lot of the kind of like cave dungeons are all obviously the same assets remixed in different ways. Um but like each dungeon still has its own kind of like neat trick to it, especially as you progress through the game, right? Like the dungeons get increasingly complex and tricky in terms of like how you actually solve it. Um, uh, and I think but like there's not. It feels like there's not like a lot of technical work that needs to go on top of that. It's just rearranging different um, existing assets. Um, but yeah, I don't know how you, like you said, how you solve the difficulty problem in that case, because like I think you've like really hit at the kind of heart of the issue there.
Yeah, I definitely like uh it's really tough because something that I remember seeing a developer talk about a little bit when it was coming to some of this like dynamic difficulty stuff is this sense of betrayal, right? That players can feel around being lied to. And the assumption that I'm going into an RPG, these numbers are relatively static, but no, they're actually kind of morphing around me all of, like all of the time, right? So for instance, God, what is a good example of this? Actually, a good example of this might be completely different. Somebody was talking about RNG in a game once, right? And she made the point. She was like, I don't think players want true RNG things to have the odds that they have. I think they want the the RNG in their games to feel more advantageous than is like accurate, right? The point that she was making was if I have 25% crit, really the game gives me 30% crit because when I have 25% crit, I want to feel it just a little bit more, right? Than it's supposed to. And we do know that this is a feeling that players have. Something that players definitely talk about, especially with stuff like crit, for instance, is this feeling that like um the game it's the randomness feels unfair, right? Which is why you get in League of Legends, for instance, the bad luck protection
Right.
that is on the crit system that does in fact do this exact thing that I'm describing. It makes the crit actually better and actually feel more sort of like up above what it is supposed to be like. You are technically critting more often than you're supposed to do. And another developer responded that says, I'm incredibly dubious of any advice that a player would or that lying to a player is the correct idea, right? That I would show a player you have 25% chance to crit, but they actually crit 35% of the time, right? Lying to a player just seems like a bad idea when it comes to this stuff. And I don't necessarily know how to parse that, but I definitely think that it's like a really interesting kind of tough thing.
Yeah,
Uh,
but part of
yeah.
this is that like human perception of numbers and especially perception of chance is much different than like reality is, right? Like 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 when we see 25% crit, we expect that one of the next 4 attacks will crit, which on average it will. But you could have like what I could do the probability if I what's the probability of that, right? Like do so the probability of not getting a crit on your first attempt is 75%, right? Probability of not getting a crit on your with 2 attacks is just over 50%. The probability of not getting a crit on 3 attacks at 75% times 0.75 is 42%, right? And the chance like if with 4 attacks, right? Come on, times 0.75. All right, so there is a 30% chance that you will not have crit after 4 attacks with 25% crit chance, right? Like that's the raw probability, right?
Yeah.
And that's a pretty significant chance, right? Like that's a 30% chance, right? And so when you don't get it, it feels bad, even though statistically it's not that unlikely to happen, right?
Yep.
I think the problem is that players want determinism, like want the kind of like intuitive recollection, right? Like 75% feels like it should happen, right? Like, like if, missing on a 75% chance feels unfair, even though you should miss 1 out of 4 times, right? Like, just to take the opposite, thing, 0.25. The chance of missing 2 attacks in a row that have a 75% chance of hitting is 6.25%, right? That's not super high. Won't happen often, but it'll happen every once in a while, and you'll be mad about it, right? Like it's or like
another piece of this that I think is players have a hard time with probability. This is something that actually I had to learn, and I don't even know where I kind of like picked it up. But somebody once said to me that so a 10% chance to do something and a 20% chance to do something, right? Those feel kind of similar, but in actuality, you are doubling your effectiveness, right?
Right.
If you have a 20% chance to do something, that's 1 in 5. If you have a 10%, that's 1 in 10, obviously, right? But it's a D&D thing, is what it
Yeah.
actually came from.
I was to say that.
Yeah, it was somebody like laid this out for me in sort of D&D terms, and it was the thing that really like, whoa, right? Because like, for instance, a +2 on any roll on a d20 is a plus 10% chance like success, right? But that bonus doesn't feel like a lot. So much of D&D, so much of Pathfinder, all of the Captain Crunching that we've ever done is built on that, right? Like that idea that, I want to stack up all these bonuses and modifiers. And the bonuses and modifiers that feel really good are these big beefy ones, +4, +5, +6, right? But +2, man, a 10% chance to increase your odds of success is like actually pretty huge, right? But we just don't have a great, way to sort of conceptualize that or feel that necessarily, right? Which I think is really interesting.
No, but
because it's just like a psychological thing.
There's a couple things there, because I think you're absolutely right, because like if you notice, D&D 5e and PF2e have much smaller bonuses, and that's because I think like the developers didn't even think about it, right? Like PF1e feels like Rocket Tag at higher levels because you have such enormous bonuses, right? Like a lot of things, like a lot of things are like basically done deals, right? Like you got a +10 bonus, it's like that's 50%, right? Like, and so it's a hard thing to feel around, and I think the later editions just did the math better, right? They're like, you need to constrain it more, right? On top of this, something I was thinking about, just we're talking about, about like the classic example of like feels bad, man, right? Is like 95% chance next com 2 with a shotgun to an adjacent enemy and you miss, right? That feels like a cheat, but what doesn't feel like a cheat? If instead of seeing 95% chance and then you miss, is if you see like, hit on a 2 or higher and then you roll a 1 on a D20, right? Like,
yeah.
I think that feels a lot better, right? Like, and I obviously the die, the die aesthetic doesn't necessarily work in all games, but like, I feel like it's like an interesting like psychology PhD paper somewhere, right? Like somewhere in there is like, why does like seeing 95% and missing feel worse than like rolling a d20 and the one coming up? Maybe it's because like you see it in front of you, right? Like what if like instead of like 95% chance and you just see a miss is like you see 95% chance and it like spins a number and then it comes up at like it's like 97 and it's like like with a sad noise effect, right? Like would that feel better than just like the miss popping up? Like does like seeing the random number make you feel better about it? I bet you there's something there. Yeah. Anyway, any psychology PhDs looking for a topic out there? That one's free. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know.
Anyway, God, I feel like this has been a sort of rambly episode, because we're off. How big is too big? Really, I just
Yeah,
want to put a button on this. This is my thing. That golden age was the golden age. Whatever. Maybe I want to say 2010 to 2014 is kind of the correct
correct era.
window. Yeah. Because I think that uh it was the right amount of content to keep things constrained enough that people didn't burn out and churn, right? And also it was much easier to sort of build a streamlined kind of core experience for a player without having to worry about all of this extraneous bullshit, basically.
Yeah, I think I buy that. I think I buy that, and I think that like I think you get gems along the way, right? Like again, Elden Ring. I think Breath of the Wild is pretty good. Breath of the Wild, I think, kind of relies on the fact that you're not going to do everything, right? Like it kind of explicitly doesn't want you to do everything, but if you do, it like breaks your weapons. So you have to keep like you always have just as much as you need, if that makes sense. Um, Man, I feel like we do a whole episode on that mechanic, right? Like people much more thorough people than us have I think done full episodes of their like game design shows on the breaking weapons mechanic in Breath of the Wild. Because it's like literally the entire purpose of that mechanic is to give you things to do, right? Like it keeps you from burning out because if you keep doing things, you'll break your weapon. You'll go need to find another one, which is just like a fascinating way of dealing with the problem. It's also hated. Like no one likes that, right? Or that's not quite like people will appreciate the design philosophy behind it, but hate the fact that it exists the way it does, right?
Yeah,
Like,
this is like perennial Twitter discourse, right? The weapon breaking system in
yeah,
Breath of the Wild. I think I do come down on it is a fundamentally good system, in the sense that like, boy, I do agree with a designer that you kind of have to break people out of their inertia of just using their like one weapon over and over and over again. But at the same time, man, it's tough to really justify that level of friction. It feels like in modern games because players are so sensitive to it.
I mean, I don't like. I think it's a correctly designed system that feels bad. If maybe that's the right way to put it, or like, it's I I don't know. Without going down the rabbit hole of like how to fix it, right? Like, I think it solves the problem, but it introduces a different problem that was like heretofore unseen, right? Like, I don't know how you deal with it, but that's I think a question for another time. Um, yeah. Well, we're basically at the end of the hour, and I'm not going to push it. Buddy, how was your week?
Boy, my week was actually kind of well. There's
Your
a
two
bunch,
weeks.
right? Because we technically didn't do anything. Yeah. So my week was actually pretty great. I talked about Control Warrior, right? Did I talk about the Control
Yeah, you
Warrior
did.
deck I'd been playing in Hearthstone? Well, it got nuked from orbit, which was maybe I don't know that I've ever seen Blizzard Entertainment nuke a deck so hard as they nuked this Control Warrior deck, right? Because 5 cards in that deck all got hit, which was just like insane. Um, Even though I do think it was a pretty dominating deck, I climbed to platinum incredibly quickly, by sort of playing that deck, and I loved every second of it. Right, like it might be my favorite Hearthstone deck I have ever played for that brief window in the meta. Just because like there were some things that were so interesting about how the deck played because it gained so much armor. It was called 100 Armor Warrior, right? Because it just had all this stuff from armor in the deck. And one of the interesting things about the deck is that in a number of aggro matchups, you play the aggressive deck, right? You don't trade with your opponent's board. You go face. You're basically playing face hunter, right? And which seems crazy, right? I say that and you must be like, buddy, that's ridiculous. How on earth does a control deck want to go face? And the answer is aggressive decks don't have healing. You have 100 armor in your deck. You are going to out armor their damage and play threats that are going to beat their face in, right? um, and like that was just really fun. That was just like a really fucking fun experience. But anyway, it got destroyed, and I do think it's sort of fair to destroy a deck like that. Something that I've always felt is true about Hearthstone and also other card games is that it is bad for a control meta is bad, right? There should always be control decks in a meta, right? There should always be decks at the high end that are trying to run you out of resources, lock down a game, outvalue you, all that kind of stuff. There should always be aggressive decks that are trying to slide under your removal, right? Really just kick your teeth in before you have a chance to respond. But the real thing that you want in any meta of any Hearthstone game is a mid-range meta, where the best decks in the meta tend to be these kind of mid-range like you know halfway point between aggro and control, essentially, right? Um, and I do think that's pretty fair. And the reason that the Control Warrior deck was so fun at the time it was so fun was because people thought the best deck in the meta was this aggressive deck. They just didn't realize how good the two cards that Warrior got in the mini set were. And I was able to essentially play for 2 weeks in an aggressive metagame where Control happened to be the best deck in the meta, right? Um, and I thought I was gonna be depressed. I thought I was gonna quit Hearthstone, right? Because like I said, the only thing that I want to do when I play Hearthstone is I want to play a good metagame, right? Um, I want to go hard for Hearthstone when the metagame is really interesting and there are really unique matchups that are like complex and demanding, right? Um, and lo and behold, Big Spell Mage is an incredibly cool and fun deck that has come out of nowhere. Big Spell Mage basically relies on the only spells in your deck are very high cost mana spells, right? So it runs 2 blizzards, right? Deal 2 to everything, freeze your opponent's board. It runs 2 Rune of the Archmage, which is cast 20 mana worth of mage spells at your opponent, right? So they are random, but they will target your opponent if able, right? And that's a 9 mana spell, and then 2 dragon heart locket or something like that. I can't remember what it's called. Which is 10 mana spell, discover 2 dragons, right? Put them into play. Dragons are obviously very premium creatures, really big stats. And you basically abuse a bunch of these effects that change the mana cost of spells. So for instance, there's a creature comes into play, it swaps the cost of a spell in your hand and a spell in your opponent's hand, right? So if you're sitting on this 10 mana summon 2 dragons card, you play this thing, well, now that's a 2 mana summon 2 dragons card, right? Or there's another card that it's 6 mana and it repeats the last spell you cast, right? So if you have a big, really powerful spell loaded up in the chamber, you can cast this 6 mana spell. Boom! Now you also have 2 dragons at the same sort of at the same time. Uh, and it turns out that those tempo swings are huge. They are monumental, and they completely own certain decks where you can just kind of blow people out of the water by summoning dragons turn after turn after turn. And so I don't know, maybe my Hearthstone dreams are saved. I climbed to Plat 5, which is maybe a personal best for me. I don't think I ever made it to Diamond ever in Hearthstone. So we'll see.
Yeah, that sounds like a ton of fun. How did they nuke um Control Warrior? I'm curious.
Okay, so the real thing that made it tough for Control Warrior, the real reason it got nuked was there were a few different types, and they wanted to target each of the types of the control warrior, right? So there was the type I was playing, that's the 100 armor control warrior. The thing they did there was actually pretty simple. There was one card, it was an 8 mana 5/8, and when you play it, it deals 5 damage to a target, and you gain 8 armor, right? Pretty, pretty good. They just shaved that down. You don't gain 8 armor, you gain 5 armor. Fair enough, right? There was another card called Shield Shatter, which is a 10 mana card that costs 1 less for each armor you have, right? Shield Shatter used to be essentially 0 mana, deal 5 to everything on the board. As long as you could generate the armor, and obviously that deck was very good about generating the armor, you could throw out a Shield Shatter and, generally speaking, take care of, your opponent's board. That had the damage dropped from 5 to 4, where 5 is a pretty useful breakpoint. 4 is obviously just going to shave off some of the power in the boards that you can take care of. Another really powerful card in that deck was called School Teacher. So the thing that makes School Teacher work is School Teacher is a 4 mana minion. It comes into play, and it gives you a minion, this 1/1 little chump minion, right? But that minion gets a battle cry that you discover, which is a spell from your class that costs 3 or less, right? So the real power of School Teacher is that you can discover spells like Shield Block or Heavy Plate that increase the amount of armor that you get, right? Because that's what we're trying to do in this sort of a deck, right? So you play this 4 mana guy, you get a 1/1 who casts a 3 mana cost spell, so you kind of have this 2 mana like discount on top of it. And importantly, it's a battle cry, right? And right now in the meta game, there is Bran Bronzebeard who comes into play and doubles your battle cries. So you play Bran, you play a School Teacher. He gives you 2 little 1/1 minions, and then you can play both of those, and they double up the spells that they cast for just huge amounts of armor or damage or value or kind of whatever you're looking for. And then the last piece is they nerfed From the Depths, right?
Wait, what did they do anything with School Teacher to nerf it?
Oh, I'm sorry. They reduced School Teacher stats. School Teacher used to be a 4 mana 5/4. It is now a 4 mana 4/3, right? And to be fair, School Teacher is a neutral card. It was run in a lot of decks. It was maybe I would say the best deck the best minion in the game, just in terms of raw value, neutrality. Yeah. Anyway, and then the last thing that they did is there was another really key piece of the Control Warrior combo, which was called From the Depths, right? The big mechanic in Rise, no, it's not called Rise of Ashara. Treasures of the Lost City is whatever it is, whatever the set is the idea is you are putting stuff on the bottom of your deck, and then there's a mechanic called Dredge, which is you look at the bottom 3 cards of your deck, you choose one of them to put it on top, right? What From the Depths did is it reduced the bottom 5, the mana cost of the bottom 5 cards of your deck by 3, and then you dredge after that, right? So you dredge up something that is, obviously much cheaper. And there was a particular variant of Control Warrior that had this kind of mildly complicated charge minion combo where you play a minion, you copy it, and then you give that minion Wind Fury so that it just hits, that it's a 36 damage combo, actually. And From the Depths was the key card in that, because you needed to reduce the mana of your combo pieces. So you would do this thing where you tuck cards from your hand onto the bottom of your deck, and then you reduce the mana cost with From the Depths in order to get the combo pieces for cheap and win the game that way. And because there's a bunch of the different variants or whatever, all of the compounding effect of all that is that Control Warrior itself actually kind of got crushed. To be fair, my understanding is that it is not dead. It is still pretty good. But, yeah.
Fair enough.
It is no longer number 1. We are back in a mid-range meta, which is probably going to be good.
Nice. Oh, all right. Well, from my point of view, I played some Destiny 2 weeks ago. We beat Anduin on Tuesday, which was fun. I've got some thoughts on some stuff, this is gonna be very monk focused. maybe 2 weeks ago, I read an article on Peak of Serenity, uh, which is the monk kind of centric website for World of Warcraft monks. And the article is like, Windwalker is a toxic spec, and the basically the thesis of that piece was that Windwalker is like not so great at single target and pretty good at AOE, and so your parse as a Windwalker monk is dependent on basically the rest of your team being bad, right? They have to like basically be focused on single target pretty exclusively in order for you to generate the numbers to like parse really well, because you're only parsing really well if you're doing big spins on things, right? And if anybody else is hitting ads, then you're not doing as well, right? Like, and I can see this in like I'm very sensitive to this in my Anduin parses, because like there are times when I will be like, cruising pretty high on the damage charts, and that's solely because during like the ads phase, I get more spins out before like you whirling them all down, right? Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and the argument in the article is this is toxic because, ideally for me, you don't whirlwind during that, and I get a bunch of spins off, and that makes my parses better, right? Because I can't make up that damage on single target because I'm not good at single target. And this was written pre-Sepulcher, but I definitely feel that, right? Like I have it less bad than like the theoretically perfect monk, or the theoretically best monk, because you're supposed to go Necrolord and use Bone Dust Brew. But Bone Dust Brew is an AoE intensifier, right? Like at least Phalanx Stomp has some like single target utility. So and like I like it doesn't this doesn't make me mad because it's not like we're like a super competitive raid group, and it hurts me a little bit just because like my parses are the things that I compare myself against. But I like have felt pretty solidly throughout the expansion that like if I'm not running Bone Dust Brew, I'm never gonna parse like at the top of the charts on any of the AoE fights, or not on the top of the charts, on the top of like my class, right, in any of the AoE fights, um, and on top of that, like it's like it doesn't bother me so much, but I get why it's a problem. Apparently this isn't a bigger problem in Mythic Plus, but like as I forget what the dude's name is, but as Peak of Serenity guy says, it's like I don't care about Mythic Plus. I only do Mythic Plus as like an enabler for raiding, and I don't even do that, right? Like I just raid. And so I'm not mad about it. I just thought it was like an interesting observation that I think is very true.
Yeah, I have some. It's interesting because I also read an article that almost had the opposite perspective, right? Which was it was talking about this is in competitive WoW. It was talking about how it's actually incorrect for everyone to be doing their AoE rotation most of the time. Typically, you want there to be a spread of AoE focused and single target focused like characters, both sort of focusing on their specific niches inside of the poll, and it included a bunch of math to back this up. But basically, the core idea is most classes have an AOE rotation, and most classes have a single target rotation. And there are some classes that are really good at single target, some classes that are really good at AOE, obviously, right? And what tends to happen is people think of Mythic Plus as a place where they want to be performing their AoE rotation, where they are trying to perform their AoE rotation kind of like over and over and over again, right? And they and so what's happening is everyone walks into a pull. They're all blasting AoE, right? But pulls tend to be a little bit mismatched when it comes to like health. So all of the little ads go down, and then there's one big ad that is still up. Everyone switches to single target to kill the big ad. And basically the math that the guy was talking about was, well, actually the best way to kill a pack is for everything to die at precisely the same moment, right? That is the highest DPS
Right.
version of any individual pack. And so what you really want is you want your single target focused guy to be single targeting the big beefy ad, and you want your AoE people to be doing the AoE stuff, because generally speaking that is going to line up the health bars so that the single target guy dies when also all of the ads die, and you have maximized sort of the DPS over time of the pull itself. And this is all in the context of timing very hard keys, right? Where, he was kind of making this argument that like what this is a thing that people can do to save themselves, to shave real amounts of seconds off of pulls, right? Because if you shave, 3 to 5 seconds off of every pull in the dungeon, times that by 20, that's a minute and a half, kind of thing. Um, and it's interesting to me that the focus there was not about parsing, right? It's not about
Yeah.
damage meters at all. The focus there is about saving time in order to do the Mythic Plus thing, which reminds me of what that guy said. I brought this up a couple of weeks ago, how one of the WoW designers talked about the way that they design things, and they don't design things around parsing, right? Where he kind of said that the goal that we put in front of you is kill the boss, time the dungeon, right? That's what we think. That is the main goal of this experience. If you want to layer on a supplemental goal, right, this little extra goal on top of it, which is parse well, right? Fair enough, you can do that if you want, but it will, that's not something that we are designing for.
Yeah.
Excuse me, essentially. So
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think part of the balance there is that timing a key feels much more like it's owned by every person in your 5-man group, whereas in a raid, you're kind of like a smaller cog in a bigger machine. And so I think parsing is kind of like how much a pulse depends on your own success is, or feels less tightly coupled, if that makes sense, right? Like whether or not we down Anduin is down to whether or not Billamong or Bairn in particular are up, or maybe or in particular up is less true than it is with a mythic key, if that makes sense. Does that make sense at all?
yeah,
Um, and like I said, I'm not mad about it. I just thought it was like an interesting, because it's hard to get a good sense of like how much you're contributing to the fight without something like a damage meter, right? Like I can't tell like outside of particular kind of like, oh, I stopped the bad mechanic from wiping the raid, right? Which are like moments, but they're typically few and far between, and usually can be picked up by one of a number of people, right? Your only kind of like easy way to measure that is like how much damage you're doing, right? And like I think to your point, right? Like this is something that he brought up in the article, which is like the correct way for us to do whatever fight. It was one of the fights in the last raid, I can't remember exactly which, is for me to solo all of the ads and everybody else to single target the boss, and then not only is that maximally efficient, but I'm also parsing well and I'm happy, right? But like things are gonna like naturally bleed over, right? Like if I happen to just like, if the ads happen to be in the wrong place, right? Like ambient AoE is going to take away from my parse, right? Like, which is, again, like you said, not the core mechanic, but it is a thing that people care about. I don't know. I think the thesis of his article is like, it is never good for a class to be good at AoE and bad at single target, because then you create these weird perverse incentives in terms of like, and for rating in particular, for the way that goes, right? Like you
yeah, I also definitely think that it is much worse for Windwalker Monk than for a lot of other classes, right? Like there are some classes that I do think are very like AoE focused in how they sort of like operate. The best classes in the game tend best classes in the game. The meta, like
yeah,
the really meta classes in the game tend to be this thing of like, we're going to pull absolutely everything and you're going to do your thing and they are all going to die, right? This is Fire Mage in 9.0, this is Destruction Warlock in 9.2, right? But like I just don't think that players have I think players have kind of an incorrect assumption. This is another sort of thing like the probability, right? Like players just sort of assume that those things where they are going to pop off in that way are more common than they will be, right? Which is why I feel like when I was like pugging keys in 9.0, I was seeing fire mages and I was dumpstering them on the charts because nobody fucking pulls like that. You know what I mean? Like most
yeah.
people are gonna pull 5 guys, maybe 3 to 6 guys. If you're lucky, you'll get 6 guys in a single fucking pack, and it's just like nobody wants to. to like risk the whole thing by pulling 1,000,000 mobs and hoping to God that the tank is going to survive and can also keep aggro so that you can perform your like incredible crazy like burst macro thing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. But yeah, I know I thought that was interesting. I also thought that, like, I think the internet fight's super fun. Um, you know, also like repeat pulling on Raglan was a little bit less fun, but it was still good. Um,
Yeah, I felt like we were really far off on Raglan, and I was just like, I don't think any of this matters. Like, there's no way we're killing him.
yeah. Well, do you have any thoughts as to why that was in particular? Like,
I just think that we're damage is kind of behind. You know, my initial thought on Raglan was that we were pulling too much damage off of the boss in order to do the things. But I think maybe we just didn't have the kind of damage that we needed to really kill the boss. Which is maybe because you know, a bunch of the sort of super high performers were out. Obviously, Marok wasn't there, for instance. But you know,
no, that makes
yeah.
sense. Yeah, and like to your point, right? Like I was pulling off to do the ads because one, I'm mobile, and two, again, the AOE thing. But they're not even like the little tiers are not even like arranged well, so I can get like a good AOE burst off, right? Like,
Yep.
um,
Yeah, I mean, when we were originally doing Rygalon, I actually my thought process actually was that too many people were pulling off, right? Which is why I specifically tunneled the boss on that fight, where I basically never touched the ads, even though I'm also really strong on the ads because I run Karain in Night Fae, and I'm getting that 5% or that 25% crit all the time when you first damage something, right? Which is obviously like really powerful. So like me going and soloing a thing is actually pretty easy. Um, but I just sort of think I think my current thinking about a lot of these WoW encounters is that 95% you learn 95% of the fight in the first 10 pulls, right? You know, once you sort of see all the mechanics a couple of times, we're most of the way there, right? And it is at that point it is this you know, this real, you know, cranking, just refining and getting better and better. And the process of sublimation, right? This is something that I was watching Farouk talk about where he was kind of like, yeah, I just got this muscle memory. And I'm like, that's it. It's the process of sublimation where you are sort of packing away the information almost into your subconscious so that you know to expect some of these things to happen and you don't make the kinds of mistakes that you have been making kind of this whole time, right? So a good example might be the ads on Anduin,
stars.
actually. Well, so the thing about the ads on Anduin is I felt like we were constantly breaking the ads on Anduin, right? And it's just about learning the little, you know, just like learning the little things of like the first one, the one that's going to get the skull marker because they come out 1, 2, 3, and I think people figured out that like, oh, actually. The first one up is the one that's going to have the skull marker, so that's where I'm going to go to. And you see the little particle on the ground, right? And you just sort of like follow that. Compared to when we were first doing them, and it was just like we were constantly putting bleeds and shit on the other Anduin ads, and that was like breaking them out of the CC. And it's just little things like that is just like I don't know, making it better.
Yeah, I mean, we also got to the point where like if one got broken, it could be handled by like you, right? Like you could, you could keep it locked down outside of like a long term CC. I also think like we did enough rotations that like essentially since we didn't explicitly say who was CCing the other two, it just kind of like came out, right? Like because like I definitely had moments where I was like, do I need to paralyze it? Do I not? Do I need to paralyze it? Do I need to not? And like by our kill, it was like I don't, and like I need to keep an eye out in case like something goes wrong. But like I can confidently go to skull and start beating on it instead of like doing this kind of like thing.
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, I actually think that's the incorrect thing. The thing that we did in my other raid group when it came to the ads was we just assigned people to the ads because the idea was it was just like, okay, when the ads spawn, you know, it was me and Patrick. Me and Patrick are gonna go to square. You know, the two rogues. The rogues are gonna go to X. Everybody else is gonna go on Skull, right? Because just between, you know, he's playing a Death Knight, I'm playing a Warrior. The two rogues, obviously, they both have kidney shots and shit like that. You know, we can just kind of keep these things locked up long enough that you know you can make the rounds and they can and the main group doing the Skull stuff kind of comes over. I also think that it is theoretically better to be damaging the ads than to not be damaging the ads. Like this is the point that another friend of ours, Jeff, was making, where somebody was like, well, why don't we just CC the ads and do them one at a time? And he was like, a low health ad is actually much better for the raid than a high health ad. So we gain a lot by assigning people to the ads early, even if it's pulling their DPS off of Anduin, right? And getting those ads low, because the last thing that we want is a situation where people come out of that downstairs phase, Anduin phases, but the ad is, the ad is super powerful or something along the lines, and blows up the raid basically.
In the chat, Lou says, "What I learned from Anduin is that if one person's blind is down, we're clearly doomed because no other CC matters."
That's spicy.
Yeah, no, it's no, I had a lot of fun with Anduin, learning it. Like it definitely felt like a push. I don't know, Raglan has felt worse, but I guess we'll get there maybe.
I think the thing that sucks about Raglan is it's such a throughput fight. Like obviously there are like mechanics to do, but Anduin, it felt like once we clicked on the mechanics, everything else was fine. We didn't have to like worry about kind of the rest of it. But Raglan, first of all, we haven't even actually finished off uh the actual like mechanics portion, right? Um and then underneath that portion, there's this huge throughput check, right? Of like, can we get him down? Even on our best pulls, we were probably 20% of his health bar from actually getting a kill. We would have hit it in a rage and just died. And that's going to be like the tough thing to really get to the bottom of. So yeah. Yeah, we need to find out Vel's secret. Yeah, I also this is referring to my friend Vel who tanks the other group. I have no idea what is going on with those tanks in that downstairs phase. Because when we were doing Raglan with them, it was a warrior and it was a death knight, and they were just able to soak both orbs with no trouble at all. But our tanks were having a bunch of problems with them, and I feel like there's got to be some secret in there to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, like somebody just doesn't know them, but like there's some mechanic that we're not understanding, right? I could see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm considering switching up my particular covenant tree just to see if I can like squeeze a little bit more out, squeeze a little bit more juice out.
So you're using Dreamweaver right now?
I'm using Dreamweaver because I am like my perpetual problem in like every game is I am too ham, and so like Pod Tender saves me from like an excessive ham moment.
Okay. Yeah, I think Karain is really good on the on Raglan because he's constantly spawning the orbs, right?
Yeah, I think
so you're getting Karain procs all the time.
Karain's the third tree, right? It's the centaur, centaur thing. I think for like crit is not very valuable for me, so I think I'm supposed to be using the first tree, but I'll look into it. I'll make it. Like I have noticed that like is very infrequent that my pod pops and that we actually win the encounter. Like the best it does for me is save me like an augmented rune, and that's it. Sure. Yeah, yes, I go to ham. Sorry, Lou. I'm sure that you have saved me from more than one death from going to ham. Yeah, but yeah. Otherwise, with my week, I played a bunch of Magic the Gathering Arena.
Sorry, not about Magic, but just I realized that I didn't talk about something else in our week.
Have
you seen any of the Overwatch 2 details?
No, because I don't care.
Okay. Yeah, well, fair enough. So I weirdly do care because as we've talked about, I got mildly back into Overwatch over the last couple of weeks or maybe months at this point. And at the Microsoft event, at the Xbox event, they announced that Overwatch 2 is officially releasing in October 4th. And that they're changing up how the game plays, and it is going to be seasonal, right? Compared to what's kind of happening now, which is free for all, nothing or whatever. And so the seasons are 9-week seasons. They're going to have a battle pass. With
That's
them,
pretty
obviously.
short, right?
Yeah, that it is pretty short. It's 2 months, right? So it is 9 week seasons with a battle pass. And on top of that, the plan is that every season introduces something new, right? So it is either a new hero or a new map, right? Every other season it alternates between the two. So in any year you're gonna get 3 new maps and 3 new heroes, which is actually kind of nuts, right? Like if you think about the cadence of how often Overwatch has released its heroes, maybe it's about 2 a year. Maybe on a good year there have been 3 a year. But for the most part, Overwatch just really hasn't been releasing stuff on that kind of a time schedule. Um, but just sort of seeing it laid out to say, oh yeah, we're gonna get a hero here, we're gonna get a map here, we're gonna get a hero here, we're gonna get a map here, is really interesting, and I'm very excited to kind of see how you know that that sort of whole thing plays out. They're also getting rid of loot boxes, which everybody is always, constantly complaining about. Though, funnily enough, I am now seeing lots of people complaining about battle passes, which I understand less. The argument against loot boxes I do get, right? The upside there is the Christmas tree effect. I'm sorry. It's like the Christmas tree effect is you go downstairs on Christmas morning and you rip open a present and you don't know what's inside, and that's cool and fun, right? That is the upside of a loot box, right? That's why it is fun to kill a boss and get the piece of gear that you want, rather than to kill a boss and get a piece of currency and then go buy that thing off of a vendor, right? It's more fun to get things when you are surprised by them. The downside of a loot box obviously has all of these implications when it comes to sort of like the psychological addictive effect of these, kind of things. I would dispute a lot of the way that people talk about these sort of things, but I'm relatively on board with, the flyover view of this is the reason why loot boxes are not as good. But apparently there is a big backlash against battle passes from a FOMO perspective, where the idea is like, oh, it's weaponizing FOMO to put stuff on a battle pass where you have to get it, which is something that we definitely talked about. But I didn't realize that it was such a divisive, negative sort of point when it comes to these things.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel that. I don't know. I yeah, I mean that makes it like everybody hates everything that like you know like I don't think there's gonna be a good model ever just because like you can't just give everybody everything, right? Like or else like the game's not gonna make money, right? Like
Yeah.
um
Yeah, I mean, people are really mad about Diablo Immortal, right? With Diablo Immortal, it's that the way to sort of power up in the deep end game is to run these things called Elder Rifts, and you can always run them, but like they only have a chance to drop very high powered legendary gems if you put in a key, essentially, kind of, and you buy those keys for cash, right? So basically the idea is like, imagine, it's not quite the same, but imagine a Mythic Plus key, you had to pay for that, right? In order to do it, and somebody mathed it out, and it would cost $100,000, for someone to max out their Diablo character, which, you know, I've I don't particularly like Diablo Immortal, and I think I sort of just think that a lot of mobile game monetization is pretty predatory,
yeah.
and there's other stuff in Diablo Immortal that I like much worse. For instance, when you complete a dungeon, you get a big pop-up that's like, "Hey, would you like to spend $2 to gain, a chest of loot from that dungeon?" That bothers me way more than this thing about like crests or whatever. But then I just started like looking into how other games do it, which are way worse. In terms of doing kind of all of these things. Also, a thing about Diablo Immortal that's apparently unique is that the whole game is literally free to play, right? Typically, apparently, what happens with some of these action RPG mobile games is the beginning stages of the game are free, but then you pay for access to deeper portions of the game, right? So you'll whatever that sort of looks like. Um,
So
uh,
honestly, if it was just paying for access, I feel like that'd be fairer, right? Like it's kind of like WoW, right? Like you get up to level 20 for free, and then you have to pay for the game, right? Like But on top, but it's you got all the predatory micro stuff on top of it, right? Which is
Yeah.
yeah. Lou says in the chat that by the time you hit the final dungeon, the interstitial is $40, which is bad. I don't play mobile games, so doesn't
Me neither.
bother
I
me.
almost sort of wonder if they did themselves a disservice by putting it on the BattleNet launcher,
Oh
like
yeah, they shouldn't
making
have.
it feel like a PC game, right? So that people are looking at it under those sorts of, scruples, because just the rules for PC games are so different.
Yeah, just like let whales have their fun Diablo theme thing and don't play it. Is my attitude, right? Like if
Yeah.
somebody really wants to pay $100,000 to have the best Diablo character, I don't care. Like that's their business, right? Like, um, you know, uh,
I hit Paragon 17 and now I'm taking a break. It's hit the boring grind phase fast. Yeah, I just that's where Diablo lives in my brain. I like if there are people who are like really hardcore Diablo people, maybe they're Path of Exile people or whatever, right? Like it is hard for me to sort of to sort of get on board with that. Maybe Diablo 4 will be different for some reason, who knows? But I don't know. This sort of genre sort of been a little bit muted for me.
yep. One thing I want to talk that I realized about while you were talking about that is I played before Saturday before the last aborted episode. I played a Rumbleverse during the beta, and that game
Sure.
is fucking awesome. I am so excited for that to come out. For real. It is essentially like it is your standard battle royale, but instead of guns, it's like fighting game moves and wrestling moves. And the combination, like it's small. I think it's like 40 people instead of 100 or whatever. But the fights play out much slower, right? Because it's like a mini fighting game thing instead of a uh, uh, and you've got a lot more kind of like little interactions. And there's some great fucking feeling things, right? Like there are a bunch of like moves that like move the other player around. The best feeling I ever got in one of these games or one of the matches is I was like on top of a tower. I got this like tackle move and I tackled someone off the top of the building. And like as you fall further, it like puts bigger effects on you. So like it's like this screaming comment and I hit the ground and kill the person. It's just like, oh, so good.
That actually sounds really appealing to me, because the thing that I've always complained about in these battle royale games, like that they are these long distance snipe fests, right? Which is what really appealed to me about
Spell book,
Spellbreak.
spell break. There we
Spellbreak,
go. Yeah.
yes. There really was not a lot of that like long range. It's all this sort of like mid range, with very kind of globby, projectile based weapons, right? Um, and so yeah, so the idea of a battle royale using those kinds of rules is really interesting. Is really cool.
Next time it gets into beta, I'll have to get you on board fast just
Okay.
because like it is
Yeah,
so much fun.
we have weirdly done a lot of episodes on battle royales, and
Yeah.
maybe it's like one of the most popular genres we've ever talked about, just because we've done one on PUBG, Warzone, Apex,
It's,
etc.
yeah. Spellbreak, right? Like, yeah. All right. Well, I just want to shout that out because it is so much fun. It is like I could see myself sinking hours and hours and hours into it when it comes out. So, um, yeah. But that's do you want to talk about anything else, or should I go to the wrap up? All right.
Good.
Well, if you'd like to tell us what you think about anything we talked about on this episode, you can email us at subdersplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@subdersplaygames.com. You'll follow us at twitch.tv/subdersplaygames where these go out live. Rate, review us on all the platforms. We've got a Patreon too if you feel like throwing us a couple of bucks. Pay for our hosting fees, I guess. That's everything I have. Buddy, you have anything else you want to promote?
I have nothing else I'm looking to promote.
All right. Well, in that case, until no, you should you were in Jeff Keighley's Summer of Gaming or the Guerrilla Games.
Oh, you're right. I was. Yeah. Sorry. That was last week. Mango. That doesn't fucking count. Yes, I was in Jeff Keighley's Summer of Gaming. We were in Gorilla Collective, where my voice showed up a whole bunch, and people pointed out that I sound exactly like this guy called the Completionist, who I have never heard of, but I watched one of his videos and I was like, fuck. Damn it. I do sound exactly like that guy. Yes, so we published 2 new videos. One is the Slug Cat Showcase for the new Rain World DLC we're working on, which just talks about the different Slug Cats that you can play in Rain World, which is like a 2D survival platformer, right? And then the other one is the gameplay overview for our upcoming roguelike, which is called Zoetti, which is about sort of using poker hands to to pair or a 3 of a kind or something along those lines to activate certain skills rather than having a kind of more traditional roguelike deck builder where you're drawing cards and you are playing the cards like you would in sort of Magic the Gathering. Zoetti, man, Zoetti is tough, and the reason I made that gameplay video is because like it is hard to grok it when I just say, "Oh, you use poker hands to activate skills." You're like, "Huh? What is that? What does that actually entail?" But I feel like once people get the demo, they are going to immediately kind of like click on to what makes Zoetti so fucking cool. So yes, those are both on the Yakupara Games YouTube channel, and please go check them out because they're cool. And my
Yep.
voice is in them.
I'm super excited for Zoetti. So,
Are you really?
yeah, no, I mean, like it looks like the type of game that I really enjoyed.
Sure.
Slay the Spire, and like saying
Yeah,
the same
yeah.
that kind of thing. But my headset is dying apparently. So before it does, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.